So there's different points here on the civic engagement. One is political participation through voting, voter registration, being an election judge, and we recorded actually one brief around election integrity that talks about those rules. Educating Americans on government and history, volunteering in organizations that build community well-being, advocating for legislation models, representing fellow citizens by appointment or by election. So really you can see there's a broad spectrum of civic engagement here, and all these actions demonstrate how civic engagement is about engaging people in a process of self-governance. And values associated with fostering civic engagement are, and maybe Kim, you could take this one, this part on, maybe you could reread values, you know.
Trusting and respecting how a community wants to take action for itself, creating agency and power in people, particularly those most affected by an issue, nurturing or fostering healthier, stronger, happier places to live, engaging community members in a process that affect them and their communities, promoting transparency and participation. People engaged in their communities tend to be more invested in their community's health and well-being. And when people volunteer their time, skills, knowledge, and enthusiasm to promote the quality of their community, they exhibit civic leadership by finding ways to positively impact their communities for the common good. They see their role in a larger context, beyond only what affects them and their families to what affects society as a whole.
So I think this is it's a good description. I mean, it just covers everything. Do you feel like it represents, your understanding of civic engagement?
Absolutely. I think, Sylvie, you kind of mentioned that when you were running through my bio. I'm thinking, I've done all that. Because when you first start in these things, it's not like you're thinking, what's the end game? You're in that moment. And I think part of that is a learning process. And as we're sitting here, we always want our kids to be lifelong learners, right? We always hear that phrase. I think we as adults, we have to become lifelong learners. And I think it's through the civic engagement process that you learn that. And you also learn to interact with people. You get out of your bubble. So it's interesting you brought up how I started out in this area. It was working on pornography. Many of the same people who we were not on the same side of that particular position, we are now working together to stop human trafficking in our local community, right? But it's from years and years of interacting. Folks may realize, I don't agree with that person on this, but they're a good person. I know they're invested in other areas. So I think
It's about building rapport. It's about building relationships. And I think that's what we forget. And I know that I was on a PTA committee on safety and civics. And I was really about biking, was really my starting point. But that led me to ensure that we had parent representation on the Transportation Commission, because that it was important to have that voice there. So someone who was on this committee was also on the Transportation Commission. There was also a parent who became involved and got elected to the park district, because it relates to the safety and of children being able to go to school safely. And you start to develop this more like systems thinking and connecting the dot between the different entities that influence, and to use your expression, move the ball forward in a positive way. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of times we think about activism. When you think civic engagement, you're like, super political engagement, but sometimes it's more being a leader of coordinating different entities and people to make a difference, and all for the well-being of a community.
Well, I think about civic engagement, the work as on the Topeka Civic Theater. I mean, talk about a networking of people who come. I always tell people, I think of the theater as it's like a bouquet of flowers. Everybody comes in looking different, but when you put it together, it's just absolutely beautiful. It's this beautiful bouquet. And I think that's what the theater does. Theater's like sports, right? I mean, everybody loves it, and no one really cares what anyone's position is on a political issue or whatever. You just love theater and you want to do a great show. And so I think those relationships actually build out an understanding in communities for people. And I go back to this. People may say, I may not agree with that person on everything, but I really like them. And I know they care about this community. I know they're invested in it. And I think that's part of what we as women can really bring to the table when we talk about civic engagement. I don't know. Maybe it's that nurturing thing that we're wired with to try and help everybody get along. It doesn't mean we can't be
Yeah.
passionate. I mean, it doesn't mean we can't be passionate about something, but I think we do nurture the ability for adults to get along, just like we do with our kids. That's how I
But
look at
I think also we care about community because we lean on community to bring up for our kids. We value the community in which our kids become become adults, and that's where they learn values. That's where they make lifetime friends, and then we hope that our kids will recreate wherever they are the community in which they grow, if it's a positive one, and if it's not, then do what they can to really enhance it. So I think that's why we value it so much. And it's, I think I love this brief and taking the time to think about it. The next section is about history, and I'm going to start reading it a little bit. To me, is really important to understand it because it's a profoundly human characteristic to build community and to be engaged in community. And we have a great quote here on which actually we built the policy circle. Is this concept of civic duty dates back to the ancient world. In ancient Athens, young men pledged to never bring disgrace to this, our city, by any act of dishonesty or cowardice, nor ever desert our suffering comrades in the ranks. We will fight for the ideals and sacred things of the city, alone and with many. We will revere and obey the city's law and do our best to incite a like respect and reverence in those above us who are prone to annul and set them at naught. We will strive unceasingly to quicken the public sense of civic duty, that thus, in all these ways, we will transmit this city, not only not less, but greater, better, and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. And I think like this quote this is from the oath of Athens, it's called the Athenian oath. It is really tremendous, and one that actually, sadly, should really be taught in our schools. So there's another quote: civic virtue was also an essential part of the fabric of society in ancient Rome, and this Roman virtue in turn influenced America's founding fathers. According to Mike Myers in Forbes, our founding fathers were formed by and highly developed as a result of something most of our leaders today don't have: a classical education. So, Kim, why don't you take the next paragraph around Alexis de Tocqueville?
In the 1830s, French sociologist and political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville traveled to the United States and was struck by American civil society and civic engagement. He documented his observations in Democracy in America, explaining, if men who live in democratic countries had neither the right nor the taste to unite in political goals, their independence would run great risks. If they did not acquire the practice of associating with each other in ordinary life, civilization itself would be in peril. Almost 200 years later, Tocqueville's acknowledgments remain true. A healthy democracy requires civil associations and a society willing to work together for the common good. For this reason, modern-day scholars are concerned by the apparent decline in civic engagement. Harvard political scientist Robert D. Putnam is well known for his writings on American civic participation and social capital. His influential book, Bowling Alone, published in 2000, examines how rates of participation in charity leagues, bridge clubs, groups like the NAACP and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and churches and synagogues started to decline at the end of the 20th century. For more on Putnam and social capital, see Policy Circle's post, Social Capital and the Value of Roundtable Discussion.
So there's a few numbers here. So there's one quote here. Did you know? Putnam describes social capital as connections among individuals, social networks, and norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that arise from them. A society of many virtuous but isolated individuals is not necessarily rich in social capital. So there are some key numbers. Civic engagement takes many forms, from volunteering to voting. Global estimates place the number of worldwide volunteers at close to 1 billion volunteers. According to the 2018 State of World Volunteerism report, there's an equivalent of 109 million full-time workers. If the number of volunteers were to comprise a country, it would constitute the fifth largest country in the world, two places behind the US, 149 million employed people. On average, 30% of volunteers volunteer through organizations, associations, and groups, while the remaining 70% volunteer through informal engagement. Women also slightly volunteer, or more likely to volunteer than men. In the US, levels of civic engagement have been falling in recent decades, as evidenced in Robert Putnam's work. There's a 2011 report by the Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement National Task Force found that withdrawal into comfortable enclaves and wariness of others who are different persist, while public confidence in the national political institution erodes in a downward trajectory. A similar federal report produced in 2013 showed declines in 16 of 20 indicators of civic health, including falling rates of volunteerism, engagement with community organizations, and flagging trust in public institutions. As of 2019, only 17% of Americans say they have strong trust in government. And listeners, we are recording this podcast at a very unique time in our world. It's called the COVID-19 crisis, where the threat of a coronavirus that is highly transmissible and could also cause death in some vulnerable communities, has been hitting us and caused us to go into our government to impose a lockdown in our communities. And I wonder what this number is going to be after, in the time that we are now, if it's already at 17%. Because right now our government is preventing us from meeting, from engaging, from face-to-face, from operating businesses, and being free to be part of the community that makes who we are as Americans. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah. When you read that number, I thought, would that be interesting today? Would it look different? Right?
Yeah, it would look different. So we also have some statistics here about in terms of engagement, in terms of voting, which is really low. So civic engagement is also voting. By international standards, there's a 2018 Pew Research study that reported the U.S. ranks 139th out of 172 world democracies and 26 out of 32 OECD countries in terms of voter participation. Over 140 million eligible Americans did not vote in the 14 midterms, which was the lowest voter participation in 72 years. In the 2016 presidential election, only about 64% of voting population registered, and voter turnout amounted to 55%, meaning close to 92 million eligible American voters did not vote. And even so, 56% of Americans believe their communities can come together and solve the country's problem despite differing political views. So again, it will be very interesting to see. We are in an election year, and it will be very interesting to see what will be the voter participation.
Great.
So Kim, do you want to read a little bit about here? This next paragraph is around civic engagement, free markets, and the common good.
Sounds great. Often it is said that good business requires civic engagement, but it's important to note the opposite is also true. Creating an environment based on free market principles where human creativity can flourish leads to greater political stability, opportunity, and stronger communities. Milton and Rose Friedman, in their popular book and 1977 TV series, Free to Choose, described the story of the United States as an economic miracle and a political miracle that was made possible by the translation into practice of two sets of ideas, both by curious coincidence, formulated in documents published the same year, 1776. One set of ideas was embodied in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, the masterpiece that established Adam Smith as the father of modern economics. It analyzes the way in which a market system could combine the freedom of individuals to pursue their own objectives with the extensive cooperation and collaboration needed in the economic field to produce our food, clothing, and housing. The key insight was that no external force, coercion, or violation of freedom is necessary to produce cooperation among individuals who can benefit from participating. The second set of ideas came from the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson to express the general sense of his fellow countrymen. It proclaimed a new nation, the first in history established on the principle that every person is entitled to pursue his own values. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Economic freedom is an essential requisite for political freedom. By enabling people to cooperate with one another without coercion or central direction, it reduces the area over which political power is exercised. In addition, by dispersing power, the free market provides an offset to whatever concentration of political power may arise. Human flourishing happens best in a society where respect for individuals' rights, self-determination, and free enterprise are promoted wherever rules are designed: family, small and large businesses, and communities. Civic engagement thrives in a culture that celebrates individual empowerment and personal responsibility.